Thanks everyone for being at this meeting. My talk's going to be a bit historical as well, and then the next speaker will be talking about the current cases here and everything. But we know where we are now today because all of us have either experienced it directly or have had friends or family members experience this directly or are involved in fighting on these issues ourselves. And we know that the situation is that there's a scourge of police brutality, not just in Southern California, but all over the United States, where police have the ability to act with complete impunity, to be able to beat people on the street, to be able to shoot people who are unarmed with their hands up. We're able to do any acts of corruption, illegal activity, and they're untouched. And that establishment protects them, the political system protects them, the courts protect them, fellow cops protect them. Everything, every institution in the system is very obviously on the side of that continuing and on the side of the police and the actions they carry out. And those of us who have been fighting on this issue know that it's now even completely pointless to even try to reach out to police officials or politicians or the courts because the justice doesn't come from there. But if we really are interested in fighting this situation where a police officer can murder an innocent person on camera in front of witnesses in a blatant murder and not be charged at all, if we really want to change the situation, if we really want to fight it, we have to understand historically how we got to where we are today. What caused it, and whose interests does all this serve? Because this is just a random order that just materialized out of nowhere. I mean, this is in existence because things have developed this way. And so we're going to look into U.S. history, the history of this country, which really isn't that old. And we know that the first 100 years of the United States, the system was slavery, where you were owned outright and bounded into slavery by your master and were forced to work, and then had no rights. You were someone else's property. That was the situation in the United States for its first 100 years of existence. Not really the proud history that the politicians tell us to honor. But we know that slavery was overthrown, and through the period of in the North when they were gradually shifting away from slavery and developing these free market systems or free labor, which meant that instead of being a slave and owned outright, you had to sell your labor to be able to eat. Wage slavery, some call it. And this is when modern prisons first formed in the northern United States, and when, of course, police tactics changed too. And the closer the South moved towards this new free labor economy rather than slavery, the more the prisons in the South began to mimic those in the North as well. And the development of modern prisons, which of course is related to the police who fill those prisons, took place as the classes of bound labor, slaves, were replaced by free wage labor. And so capitalism is deeply entangled with the roots of mass incarceration. And this developed as an attempt to subjugate black labor. The immediate aftermath of the abolition of slavery is where the first boom in the prison population took place. And even during radical Reconstruction, the forces of white supremacy were able to recapture states and utilize their position in those states to incarcerate larger and larger numbers of black people. The criminal justice system became a way to funnel common laborers who are recently freed slaves back into the plantations. And it also, on the other hand, served to stifle radical voices, which I'll get into. So after the abolition of slavery, this thing emerged called vagrancy laws. Like if you see a sign that says no loitering or something. That came from these vagrancy laws, which meant that if you're a vagrant or a loiterer, which means like you're just hanging out outside, you could be arrested for being a vagrant. And of course, it was African Americans who were arrested for vagrancy. And in fact, at this time, you didn't have to be a police officer to arrest someone. You just had to be a white person. Any white person had the right to arrest any black person for being a vagrant at this time. And what the sentence for being a vagrant was you were sentenced to labor. which means you had to go work for free somewhere, much like slavery. In some states, like in the South, like in Mississippi, any black person could be asked at any time for proof of employment. And if you didn't have proof of employment, you'd be arrested and sentenced to slave labor. And by the late 1800s, this had developed more and more into something called convict lease labor, where business owners could rent out prisoners for a very low cost. And so the state prison would say, you have this person to work for, half a cent a day or something. And this was a new source of cheap labor. And this convict labor was especially brutal. And in fact, many argue that this was more brutal than slavery. Because under slavery, slaves were the property of the master, and so there is this degree of wanting your slave to live, to be able to work for you. But convict lease labor was very brutal because the people who worked at the prisons did not care whether that person lived or died. And most people who were arrested then and subjected to convict lease labor normally did not live through their 10-year sentence. Many of them were killed in the jails or on the job by the people who were employing them. And so during all of this, the police increased their presence in oppressed communities and harassing and arresting people for nothing at all. And this was to maintain that order of white supremacy, because there is such upheaval in society when slavery was overthrown, there was radical reconstruction, and so the forces of white supremacy were using this as a way to maintain their dominance and to subjugate this newly freed population and to continue to have a source of cheap labor. And the important thing to remember is that these changes coincided with two main factors. The changes in the economy that required the capitalist class to find new ways to subjugate labor and to suppress political power in the black community. And then there was this other major boom in aggressive police tactics and incarcerating massive numbers of oppressed people. And this was in response to yet another change in the economy, to masses of people being thrown out of the productive process. And this occurred in the 1970s. And prior to the 1970s, people from oppressed communities had some access to some decent paying jobs. This is because the manufacturing industry was so big in the United States. And so if you were working on an assembly line or you're working in a factory, that's a high-skilled job because you're doing complex things. You're building cars and things like that require a high degree of skill. And so employers have to be able to pay people something decent to be able to have someone that's very high-skilled at that level. And so there's this sector of oppressed people that still had a relatively good way to live because they were having benefits and they were having increasing wages because of the manufacturing industry. And then in the 1970s, changes in technology allowed the capitalist class to minimize its labor costs, mainly through making new machines that could take the place of workers in these factories. So now if you watch a video of a car being assembled, it's all robotic arms, right, that put the doors on the cars and things like that. That used to be people, very high-paid laborers, doing those jobs, building those cars, building these furniture in factories. And now there's just these machines that replace them. And so where do all those people go who just got laid off? I mean, it eliminated millions of decent-paying jobs in the United States when this happened. And in addition to minimizing labor costs by replacing workers with machines, they also went to war on social services, meaning that they wanted to not pay much labor costs, and so they were gutting things that were providing things like health care and food assistance for people who were poor. So all these people get laid off in this high-tech boom, creating new masses of unemployed. And so the system had to do something with these new masses of unemployed, and lots of them they put in jail, just like they did with the abolition of slavery. So kept out of the labor market, huge numbers of African Americans became trapped in inner city ghettos, heavily patrolled by the police, or ended up in the prison system. This is important to talk about because we're talking about police murder and police brutality, but like if you survive that encounter with a police officer, you're still getting unjustly wrapped up in the criminal justice system, in the prison system, and that in itself is a massive epidemic for people and a huge issue for many, many families, is having your loved ones stuck in the prison system for reasons that are no fault of their own. In addition, the capitalist class profits by having this super exploited layer in society. And now this is another reason for police brutality, why it benefits the system. There's this aspect, of course, of something to do with the unemployed and it benefiting them that way. But targeting certain sectors of society and keeping them subjugated and keeping them super, super oppressed by having communities that are kept in such desperation because of poor conditions, but then you have these police who are on top of you at all times, searching you, stopping and frisking you, shooting you, arresting your family members. This creates a super exploited layer in society. And that benefits this system, it benefits the capitalist class, because that is a layer of society that they can give the lowest wages possible. And it creates a low-wage sector for them to be able to profit off of. And then by having one sector that's pushed down into super low wages, it lowers wages for all workers because it lowers the bar. Just like unions being able to win union contracts, that raises wages for all workers because it's setting the bar there. And so intense police occupation of these communities serves that example. And this is called this targeting of certain sectors of society to keep them subjugated. This is what's called national oppression. The exploitation of a whole people based on their nationality. Not meaning a country, but a nation being sharing common territory and language and common culture. And to say that national oppression doesn't exist, we just have to look at things like the stop and frisk policy in New York City, where the NYPD admits that the most likely person to have a gun or drugs illegally is a white man. Yet, the victims of stop and frisk, where they randomly stop people and search them, is like 98% African American men. And so that tells you something. If they're admitting that more likely you're going to find it on a white person, why are they targeting African American and Latino communities with this tactic? It's not about finding weapons, it's not about finding drugs. It's keeping a community in fear and subjugated. And national oppression, as I said before, allows the capitalist class to extract higher profits from the workers in these oppressed nations, but it also divides people. It promotes racism, it promotes national rivalries, it promotes chauvinism, it promotes bigotry. And the reason that we started this meeting with this talk about the gay and lesbian community fighting against the police is because that's a form of special oppression also. That's a sector of people that's specially oppressed by capitalism to serve the same function as specially oppressing Latino and African American communities. And creating that disunity, right? I mean, when gay and lesbian people were fighting the police in the 60s and the 70s, it would be a scary thing for the establishment if they were fighting alongside people in Latino communities who are also fighting, and people in African American communities who are also fighting. All these other nationally oppressed groups and special oppressed groups dealing with the same exact thing. This system is strongest when those people are not fighting side by side and when they're finding ways to get people to turn against each other or be racist or be sexist or whatever. In addition to police repression in oppressed communities being in the interest of profits and warehousing masses of unemployed people that the system can't accommodate, it serves another function also rather than labor and profits. And that reason, I want to read a quote from Frederick Ingles, one of the pioneering Marxist, well, wasn't a Marxist at the time, worked with Marx, but an important theorist for us. And he said that each succeeding winter brings up afresh a great question: what to do with the unemployed? But while the number of unemployed keeps swelling from year to year, there is nobody to answer that question. We can almost calculate the moment when the unemployed, losing patience, will take their own fate into their own hands. This is a recognition by the establishment, by the system, run by the super, super rich, that things are getting worse and worse for us every day. More and more people being unemployed, more and more budget cuts. But they also know that those types of conditions can't go on forever without all those people who are living through it, all of us, decide that we want to stand up. And so this is the other side to why the prison population and police brutality and these police occupations of our communities increased. In the 60s and 70s, which was a time of great social upheaval, you know, they characterize the 60s and 70s as this like stereotypical, it was like these hippies who just like wanted to smoke pot, and then there's like these generational classes between young people and old people. That's how they try to teach us the history of the 60s and 70s. But it was a time of great and profound social upheaval that brought into question revolution, or the masses of people actually taking control of society and taking out of the hands of those rich politicians and their banker friends who tell them what to do. The black freedom struggle of the 60s and 70s inspired other oppressed communities. It inspired Chicanos, it inspired Puerto Ricans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, women, gays and lesbians, all were coming out into the street in masses and fighting together and fighting on their own issues. And combined with the defeat of the United States in Vietnam, at this time it seemed that the capitalist class in the United States was under assault from all sides, both domestically and losing wars abroad, and it seemed like it was losing at this point. Also at this time, the civil rights movement for legal equality for African Americans started turning away from simply legal equality, equality under the law, and challenging social and economic inequality. And inspired by these anti-colonial movements nationwide as well, and the problems of their day-to-day existence, slum conditions, unemployment, oppressive policing, was inspiring people to fight, and people were rising up all over the country. And there was a series at this time of very significant uprisings of people against police violence, against racism, and against unemployment. In 1964, and this is one of the first significant police brutality uprisings against police brutality, the NYPD killed a black teenager in Harlem. And this led to a demonstration of thousands of people, close to 10,000 people in Harlem, and then the police just attacked it right away. But people fought back, and it took 5 days and 6,000 cops to shut that down. But that uprising, you know, they call it a riot, and I'll use the word riot again. But just to clarify, that they like to call it a riot, just like they called what happened in Anaheim a riot. But that was not a riot. I mean, that was legitimate anger being aired. And these riots that took place through the 60s and 70s, even the state admits that, you know, this riot in Harlem that I just mentioned, that the governor reported that no residences were burned, damage to schools, libraries, and churches and public housing was extremely minimal and not intentionally targeted. And the target was white-owned establishments, meaning the target was people mad about racism in the community and mad about unemployment, because these are the businesses that would not hire people. These were political acts, these things that were taking place, these spontaneous uprisings. And of course, at all times, these people were portrayed as hoodlums, that they had no reason for being angry, they had no reason for rising up. People in Anaheim, when they fought back, they were just criminals, and they had no reason to be taking to the streets and taking over the streets and confronting the police and confronting city council. In 1967, President Johnson convened an advisory commission on civil disorders to study all of the riots that were happening across the country, because it was becoming a very, very common thing, and found that the upheaval was a result of the social conditions, of poverty, and of reacting to racism and police harassment. And you know, things like, you know, there were surveys done among people in these communities who weren't actually rioting themselves, right? I mean, thousands of people were taking part in these mass so-called riots and demonstrations, but when they surveyed people in the community who weren't directly participating, the majority were supporting those uprisings and saying, yeah, I think that's a good idea that they're doing that, and I agree with the reasons that they're doing it. And so you can imagine the consciousness of people at that time was at such a heightened state. And, you know, in the 60s and 70s, there was hundreds of these riots. In fact, in 1967 alone, when that, you know, this commission was developed to study them, there was 164 significant uprisings in 1 year. So imagine what happened in Anaheim happening 164 times in a year. I mean, this is a time of great, great upheaval. And this is because of the contradictions created by the system, created by capitalism. That racism, unemployment, poor living conditions, police harassments, all things that exist inevitably under the system, was creating the conditions for people to fight back. It frightened the politicians. And so from the early 60s to the mid-70s, they responded. And the way they responded to try to stop this upheaval, try to stop people from realizing that they had the power and they could join together and win justice, they had a two-pronged approach. And one side of that approach was increasing social services in these communities. So, you know, there was a riot in Watts, right, after there is an act of police brutality that's very significant that occurred in '67. If you go to Watts today, there's a lot of community service there. There's nice parks. There's government buildings that provide, you know, food stamps and things like that. Those are there because of the riots. Because the system was so scared, we are keeping these people so miserable and so subjugated that we have to give a little something to try to stop them from rebelling. So that was the one part to the strategy. The other part was heavy-handed police tactics, where anytime people came out, they just crushed it violently. President Nixon, who was president at the time, and numerous other politicians started building their careers over smashing social unrest because they had created this narrative that they needed law and order and that there was these gangs of hoodlums who were creating problems, but really it was masses of people in society. And during this, newly militarized and expanded police forces, as well as national law enforcement and intelligence arms, grew dramatically in size and strength. Between 1966 and 1976, the time of this great social upheaval, the amount funded and size of police forces increased 5 times what it was in the previous decade. The number of police nationwide grew by 40% just in this period, so a huge increase in the number of cops. And billions of dollars of our tax dollars started flowing into the police departments to give them new weapons and you know, riot gear and all of these things. And also paramilitary units were formed. The SWAT team was formed after the Watts riots. And the official reason for police and for SWAT is to, you know, stop crime from taking place and to defend communities. What was the first act, the first time SWAT was ever used? It was to raid the offices of the Black Panther Party, a political group, who wasn't committing any crime. It was used as a tool to try to stifle political power and political activism. And in addition to responding to the needs and for profits, in addition to using police violence as a way to keep communities super exploited and super oppressed, this system of mass incarceration and police in our communities arresting people every day, the system profits from that greatly. We're seeing now more and more prisons are privately owned, for-profit prisons, where you go to jail and then you're working in the field somewhere, or you're working making clothes for a company, making, you know, 8 cents a day, while some big corporation is reaping tons and tons of profit. You have judges who get $1 million kickbacks from prisons for sending youth to jail to these for-profit prisons. And so, you know, and in addition to the war on drugs, which, you know, was carried out in the 80s and 90s, billions of dollars became flooded in to the police forces and to weapons contractors. And so there's all this profit motive in all of this as well, or that's not the reason it exists, but this is this other side to it that we have to be aware of. So what does all of this teach us? All of this stuff that we went over. Well, we know that police harassment is meant to keep a sector of society super repressed and exploited, and because this is the overall purpose of the police forces, ultimately, it's perfectly acceptable to the establishment for police to act with impunity, for them to act with extreme violence. You know, why would a system care about punishing killer cops when those cops are essentially doing exactly what the system needs them to do? They want us scared. They want us living in fear of confronting them, the people we need to confront. And they don't want us to have power, right? I mean, when we stand up and say, this cop murdered my brother, he should go to jail, and we demand that he goes in jail, they don't want us to have that power to be able to say this person belongs in jail. That's their system, that's their thug, right? They don't want us to be able to exercise anything in our interests. So they want us to live in fear, but what makes them fearful? What makes them scared? If all of these police tactics are aimed at crushing people trying to stand up, crushing political dissent, what is it that does the same to them? You know, what made the police and the judges and the corrupt politicians and the super rich all tremble in fear? Well, they wouldn't have funneled billions of dollars into the police forces and responded to these protests nationwide in the way they did if they didn't fear that those protests were exactly what could challenge their power, exactly what could win justice. They're terrified of our organization. They're terrified of our power. They're terrified of unity, right? They're terrified of white, black, Latino, Asian, gay women all joining together, united, saying, we all are victims of police violence, or our friends are, and we are all against this, and we're all going to join together and stand up. That's very scary to them. You know, police nationwide, I can tell you now, are scared of this march on July 21st. They're scared of the fact that cars and buses from New Mexico and Northern California and San Diego are all coming here to this historic place. They're scared that 26 families and counting every single day are joining together to say, on this day, on July 21st, we're going to expose to the country that this is an epidemic and we are all united and fighting it. So we want to win justice for every individual family who's been a victim of police violence and police brutality. But we want to change the system as a whole that has police violence built into it. A society where we, the people, have the power, not this tiny group at the top that acts with impunity.